Before the light came, before the birds, before the first call of prayer rose from the valleys, something moved in the darkness of the Ethiopian highlands. Not one thing. Hundreds of thousands of things. An army. But not the army that history expected to win. By the time the sun rose over the mountains of Tigray on the morning of March 1, 1896, the world would be forced to reckon with something it had refused to believe, that an African nation, armed with strategy, sovereignty, and unshakable will, could defeat the full force of a European colonial army in open battle. Not symbolically. Not narrowly. Decisively. In a single morning, the logic of the entire colonial world cracked. This is the story of the Battle of Adwa. One of the most consequential military engagements of the 19th century. A victory so complete that it shook capitals from Rome to London, reverberated through the African diaspora, and planted the seed of an idea that would take 50 more years to fully bloom, that colonized peoples could be free. But here is the part most people never hear. This victory did not begin on a battlefield. It began with a single word, hidden inside a diplomatic treaty, that one emperor refused to let stand. To understand how this happened, we have to go back. Back to a treaty. A single word. And one emperor who refused to be erased. In the year 1884, the most powerful nations on earth gathered around a table in Berlin, Germany. They spread maps across it, not just maps but the maps of Africa, and they began to draw lines through Rhine forests, lines through kingdoms, lines through cultures that had existed for centuries before any European had ever set foot on African soil. Colors spreading outward from the coasts, eating inward across the continent. Ethiopia holds its color. Alone. This was the Berlin Conference, and it formalized what historians would come to call the Scramble for Africa. Within 2 decades, European powers, Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Germany, would claim nearly the entire continent as their colonial territory. By 1895, only 2 African nations remained uncolonized. Liberia, established by freed American slaves. And Ethiopia, one of the oldest Christian kingdoms on earth. Think about that for a moment. An entire continent. And only 2 nations still standing outside the colonial grip. The logic of colonialism was, in its own grotesque way, consistent. It told itself that European civilization was superior, that African peoples were incapable of self-governance, that conquest was not only profitable but righteous. It was a lie dressed in the language of progress. But Ethiopia had not read their literature. The Ethiopian Empire in the 1890s was not the fragile, disorganized state that Italian strategists imagined. It was a consolidated, ancient Christian empire, home to multiple ethnic groups, regional lords called races, and a military tradition stretching back millennia. Its capital, Addis Ababa, had been newly established in 1886 by a king who was rapidly becoming something much larger. His name was Sal Miriam. The world would come to know him as Emperor Menelik II. And Italy was about to make the most catastrophic miscalculation of the colonial era. Born on August 17, 1844, Sal Miriam rose from the kingdom of Shua, a regional power base in central Ethiopia, to claim the imperial throne in 1889 following the death of Emperor Johannes IV. His coronation name was Menelik II, consciously invoking the legendary Menelik I, said in Ethiopian tradition to be the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The symbolism was intentional. And the ambition was real. On his face. Regal. Composed. Eyes that suggest calculation more than ceremony. By the early 1890s, Menelik had acquired approximately 100,000 rifles and dozens of artillery pieces, sourced largely through French and Russian arms dealers, who had their own interests in countering British and Italian expansion in the region. He built coalitions with regional lords. He modernized his army while preserving its traditional command structure. He watched and he planned. And what he was planning, Europe had no idea. Now, history has often treated Empress Taytu Betul as a footnote to her husband's story. Ethiopian chronicles tell a very different story. Born around 1851, Taytu was Menelik's most trusted political partner, sharp, deeply religious, and fiercely opposed to any compromise that would diminish Ethiopian sovereignty. In the critical negotiations that preceded the war, it was Taytu who historians document as the most uncompromising voice in the imperial court. She accompanied the army on the Adwa campaign, not as a symbolic presence, but commanding her own contingent of soldiers and servants. When Italian envoys attempted to negotiate terms that would have given Italy ongoing influence over Ethiopian foreign affairs, Teta refused. Her role is well documented in Ethiopian sources, though largely absent from European accounts, reflecting a bias that later historians have worked hard to correct. She was not a footnote. She was a pillar. Menelik's senior commanders were equally formidable. Ras Makinen Wald Mikhail, governor of Hara, was one of Menelik's most trusted military minds, and he had already proven himself in battle well before the defining morning at Adwa. History would later remember Ras Makinen as the father of Ras Tafari Makinen, who would one day be crowned Emperor Haile Selassie I. That lineage matters. We will come back to it. Remember to like, subscribe and turn on your notification for more history stories. Share to help others find this video. Let's continue. Ras Mikhail, governor of Wollo, commanded a major division that would engage Italian forces on the northern flank. Ras Jabehu commanded the right wing, and would pay for it with his life, becoming one of the senior Ethiopian officers killed in the battle. These were not ceremonial titles. These were warriors. On the other side of the mountains stood a very different kind of man. General Oreste Baratieri, Italian governor of Eritrea, commander of the colonial forces, and a man trapped between his own military judgment and the political demands of Rome. Born in 1841, Baratieri was a veteran of Italian unification campaigns. Experienced. Decorated. But by early 1896, he was in an impossible position. His supply lines were stretched. His intelligence on Ethiopian positions was poor. He knew the terrain was unfamiliar and the enemy was formidable. He knew. And yet, he moved forward anyway. Prime Minister Francesco Crispi's communications to Baratieri in late February 1896 explicitly criticized his caution. One documented telegram described the military situation as a wasting disease, pressuring Baratieri to advance or be replaced. His subordinate generals would bear the cost of that pressure. General Vittorio de Bormida commanded the right column. General Giuseppe Arimondi commanded the center. Both would be killed on March 1, 1896. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before the battle, there was the trap. And the trap had been set years earlier, inside a single treaty clause that most of the world had already forgotten about. Every great conflict has a hinge, a moment small enough to fit in the palm of your hand that, in retrospect, changed everything. For the Battle of Adwa, that hinge was a single word in a diplomatic treaty. On May 2, 1889, representatives of the Kingdom of Italy and the Empire of Ethiopia signed the Treaty of Wuchale. On the surface, it was a friendship agreement, defining territorial boundaries and formalizing relations between the two states. Straightforward. Routine diplomacy. Or so it appeared. But buried in Article 17 was a time bomb. The Italian version of the article stated that Ethiopia must conduct all its foreign affairs through the Italian government, effectively rendering Ethiopia an Italian protectorate. The Amharic version, the Ethiopian version, stated only that Ethiopia may use Italian diplomatic channels if it wished. Must. And may. Two words. Two entirely different realities. And someone, whether by design or by deliberate ambiguity, had made sure they did not match. Italy immediately began informing European governments that Ethiopia was now an Italian protectorate. Letters went to London, Berlin, Paris, Vienna. The international community, eager to accept the convenient fiction, largely did not object. Menelik objected. In 1891, he wrote to the major European powers explicitly rejecting the Italian interpretation. In 1893, he formally repudiated it entirely. He communicated, clearly and in writing, that Ethiopia was not, and had never been, a protectorate of any power. In a letter that circulated widely at the time, he wrote that he had no intention of being an indifferent spectator if the distant powers held the idea of dividing up Africa. It's almost impossible to overstate how extraordinary that was. In 1891, with nearly the entire continent already colonized or in the process of being so, one emperor looked at the most powerful governments on earth and said, "Not us. Not here. Not ever." Italy did not accept the repudiation. Diplomatic channels closed. And both sides began preparing for what everyone could see was coming. The only question was when, and on whose terms. By the autumn of 1895, the Italian colonial administration in Eritrea had made its calculations. Italian forces had been probing Ethiopian positions and testing the boundary lines. Rome wanted a result. It wanted a protectorate. It wanted to show the other European powers that Italy belonged at the table of empires. Menelik had been watching. And in September 1895, he issued one of the most extraordinary military proclamations in African history. He called all Ethiopians, regardless of religion, region, or rank, to defend the nation. The resulting force, according to scholarly estimates, numbered between 70,000 and 100,000 fighting personnel. It was accompanied by artillery. It was organized, motivated, and led. Pause for a moment and consider the sheer scale of that. 100,000 people, moving through the highlands with a single shared purpose. That does not happen by accident. That is the product of a leader who had spent years preparing for exactly this. That army began moving north. The suggestion of an enormous army in motion. Dust rising from the valleys. Morning light. Before Adwa, there was Amber Alagi. On December 7, 1895, Ras Makanen's forces encountered an Italian column at the mountain pass of Amber Alagi in Tigray. The engagement was short and decisive. The Italian column was overwhelmed. Major Pietro Toselli was killed. The survivors retreated north. In Rome, the news was received with shock. In Addis Ababa, it was received as confirmation. The strategy was working. But something was also shifting in Rome. Something dangerous. A government does not admit to Parliament that its colonial adventure has begun to collapse. It doubles down. Ethiopian forces then moved on Mekelle, a town in Tigray where an Italian garrison had fortified itself in an old castle. The siege lasted through the cold highland winter. On January 22, 1896, the garrison surrendered, and then Menelik did something that no one expected. He released them, and he provided the Italian soldiers with food and escort northward. It was a deliberate signal. Ethiopia was not waging a war of annihilation. It was enforcing its sovereignty. The Italian government interpreted it as weakness. That misreading would cost them everything. By February 1896, both armies were positioned near the town of Adwa in the Tigray highlands. A standoff had developed, and for both sides, it was becoming unsustainable. The Italians were running low on food. Supply lines from Eritrea were stretched beyond capacity. Morale was fraying. From Rome, the pressure was escalating daily. On the evening of February 28, 1896, Baratieri called a council of war with his senior generals. The outcome was a decision to advance, to move the Italian columns through the darkness toward Adwa and secure a position from which they could force a battle. Baratieri divided his force into 4 columns. General de Bormida would take the right. General Arimondi the center. General Albert I would lead the vanguard on the left. General Elena commanded the reserve. They would march after midnight, through mountain terrain that Italian maps, as would become catastrophically clear, had gotten significantly wrong. The march began. And the clock, for the Italian Empire in East Africa, had started counting down. 4 Italian columns moved through the dark. They were supposed to be coordinated. They were supposed to maintain contact with one another as they advanced on the Ethiopian positions. The terrain had other plans. The ridgelines and ravines of the Adwa region did not match. The Italian maps. Columns that were supposed to move in parallel began to diverge. The darkness made it worse. Officers navigating by inaccurate charts in unfamiliar mountains could not know how far they had drifted from one another. By the time the sky began to lighten, by the time the sun touched the peaks and the birds began to call, the 4 Italian columns were separated. Not by a small margin. By substantial gaps of unscouted, enemy-held terrain. Ethiopian scouts had been watching all night. All night. Riders had moved between the Ethiopian positions and the imperial command. Menelik and his commanders were receiving reports. The Italians are moving. They are separating. Their left column is ahead of the others. There are gaps between them. The emperor understood immediately what this meant. Every hour of preparation. Every coalition built. Every rifle acquired. Every alliance forged with every regional lord across the empire. It had all been leading to this single window of opportunity, and it was opening right now, in the pre-dawn dark, because the Italians had handed it to him. He moved. General Albertone's left column made first contact with Ethiopian forces shortly after dawn, at approximately 6 o'clock in the morning. His brigade encountered Ras Mikhail's forces, and the engagement that followed was already shaped by one fatal fact. No other Italian column was close enough to support them. Menelik's commanders moved with precision. Ethiopian divisions were directed against each isolated Italian column simultaneously, not giving the Italians any opportunity to consolidate or reinforce. It was the military principle of defeat in detail, the destruction of a larger force by engaging its parts separately, before they can combine. Simple in concept. Devastating in execution. Albertone's column was overwhelmed. The general himself was captured alive. General Arimondi's center column, already separated from both flanks, found itself engaged before it could link up with any supporting force. The terrain worked against the Italians at every turn, the same ravines and ridgelines that Ethiopian soldiers had known since childhood. Arimondi was killed. On the right, de Bormida's column had moved into unscouted ground and found itself isolated in broken terrain that denied it the clear lines of fire and movement that European tactics assumed. De Bormida was killed. 2 of the 3 principal Italian column commanders were dead. The 3rd was captured. The reserve under General Elena could not effectively reach the front. Baratieri, receiving fragmentary reports of disaster from every direction, ordered retreat. Within approximately 4 to 6 hours of first contact, the entire Italian battle plan had ceased to exist. Let that land. 4 to 6 hours. That is how long it took to dismantle one of the most significant colonial military campaigns of the 19th century. The retreat became a rout. Italian soldiers, separated from their units, moving through unfamiliar terrain, the collapse was complete. By early afternoon, the Battle of Adwa was over. The scale of the Italian defeat was without precedent in the history of European colonial warfare. Depending on the source, Italian dead numbered between 4,000 and 6,000, a figure that includes both Italian regulars and the Eritrean soldiers who had been conscripted into the colonial army. Approximately 1,400 were wounded. Nearly 2,000 were taken prisoner, including General Albert I himself. Ethiopian casualties were also significant. Historians estimate between 4,000 and 7,000 killed and wounded, though figures vary considerably across sources. An Italian army of roughly 17,000 to 20,000 men had been destroyed as a fighting force in a single morning. The news traveled fast. Headlines. Faces of people reading in city squares. Shock rendered in still imagery. Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, who had pushed Baratieri to advance, who had called the military situation a wasting disease, who had demanded action, received the news of Adwa on March 2. By March 9, his government had collapsed. The same man who had pressured a general into marching into those mountains was now being swept out of power by the consequence of that pressure. Public protests erupted in Italian cities. The humiliation was acute. Italy had staked its claim to imperial respectability on this campaign, and that campaign had ended in catastrophe on a mountain the Italian public could barely locate on a map. Baratieri was court-martialed. Acquitted on most charges, but his career was finished. Negotiations for peace began almost immediately. On October 26, 1896, Italy and Ethiopia signed the Treaty of Addis Ababa. Its terms were clear, unambiguous, and final. Italy formally and unconditionally recognized the absolute independence of the Ethiopian Empire. The Treaty of Wuchale, the treaty with the time bomb inside it, was nullified entirely. The protectorate that had existed only on Italian diplomatic correspondence was officially dead. It was the first time in the colonial era that a European power formally recognized an African nation's sovereignty as a direct consequence of military defeat. Italy retained Eritrea. But Ethiopia, ancient, sovereign, unconquered, remained. For 40 years, Italy would not try again. When Mussolini finally invaded in 1935, it was in part to erase the memory of Adwa from Italian national consciousness. The League of Nations failed to stop him. Emperor Haile Selassie, son of Ras Makinen, grandson of the Adwa generation, stood before the assembly in Geneva and invoked the sovereignty that had been won in 1896. It was not enough that time. But the world heard it. And the world did not forget. News of the Ethiopian victory spread faster than the telegraph lines could carry it. In African American newspapers, in the writing circles around W.E.B. Du Bois, the victory at Adwa was received with something close to awe. Here was proof. Not an assertion. Not a hope. Proof, in the language that the colonial world understood most clearly, the language of military fact, that African forces could defeat European armies. This was not a small thing. In 1896, in a world where colonialism was presented as the natural order, where maps were drawn in European colors and African sovereignty was spoken of in the past tense, a single morning in the mountains of Tigray had torn a hole through that narrative. and people across the world stepped through it. In the Caribbean, in nascent Pan-African political networks, in the salons of black intellectuals in London, Paris, and New York, Adwa entered the imagination as a symbol of what resistance could achieve. Leaders including Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta would later reference the Ethiopian victory in their own political writings and speeches as the independence movements of the 20th century gained momentum. The Rastafari movement, emerging in Jamaica in the 1930s, placed Ethiopia, and the lineage of Menelik, at the center of its theology. The identification of Ethiopia as Zion, the veneration of Emperor Haile Selassie, the use of Ethiopian colors, green, gold, and red, as symbols of African liberation. All of it traces a direct line back to the world that Adwa made possible. In Ethiopia itself, the memory of Adwa became the foundation of national identity. Victory of Adwa Day is celebrated on March 2 each year, the day after the battle, as a national holiday. It is taught in schools as the central narrative of Ethiopian sovereignty. Adwa did not end colonialism. But it proved that colonialism was not inevitable. That distinction mattered enormously. It still does. On the morning of March 1, 1896, as the sun rose over the mountains of Tigray and 4 Italian columns moved blindly through terrain they did not know, Emperor Menelik II watched from higher ground. He had spent years preparing for this moment. He had repudiated a fraudulent treaty. He had assembled a coalition of warriors from every corner of the empire. He had acquired modern weapons without surrendering ancient identity. He had released captured soldiers as a diplomatic act, not a sign of weakness. He had waited. And when the Italian columns separated in the dark, he moved. In 6 hours, history changed. What happened at Adwa was not a miracle. It was not luck. It was the product of strategic clarity, political will, diplomatic intelligence, military preparation, and a fundamental refusal to accept the story that others were trying to write about you. Menelik II refused it. Empress Tatu refused it. Ras Makanen, Ras Mikhail, Ras Jabehu, whose name we should say clearly, because he died on that field, they all refused it. And in refusing it, they changed the world. The battle lasted 6 hours. Its echo has lasted 130 years, and it is still going.
They tried to write our ending before our story began. Drew lines across our breathing, said this was never our land. But something lived inside us older than their maps and their chains. A fire they couldn't measure, a truth that always remained. You can't conquer what refuses to bend. You can erase what rises again and again. We are the mountains that wouldn't move. We are the blood that had something to prove. We are the morning that broke through the night. We are the ones who stood up and fought for the light. 130 years, and still standing. Still standing.